Hello, this is Joe Neville and welcome to Python Functions. This is the fourth video in my series about Python and ArubaOS-CX. In this video, don't repeat yourself. What we're going to do is take some of my scripts from previous videos and we are going to convert them to use functions. Now, functions are essentially building blocks of code that can be reused, so we're not constantly having to repeat ourselves in our scripts. It's one of the principles of writing good, concise code. The aim is to do the actions that we've done previously, so log in, get the VLAN table, configure a VLAN and log out, but we're going to do that all with functions and all via the API. Okay, so let's dive right in then. Over on the top right here, this is one of the scripts that I wrote in my previous video. So this is to log in and configure so there's the login, then we configure a VLAN, then we grab the VLAN table and print that to screen, and then we log out. As you can see, I'm not using any functions there. It's just sequential code that runs top to bottom. Down the bottom here, I have a collection of functions that I'm going to build up into a script over on the left here. So as with my previous videos, I will copy some of it across, but we'll step through so that I'm explaining each step as we go. Okay, so first of all, let's copy across the imports and the warnings because they are going to be the same from the previous video. Okay, so we've got our imports that we need. We're going to use requests, get pass, and the import JSON there, and we've got the warnings. Fine, right. So next up we are going to use the credentials. So this is just still quick and dirty stuff in the lab. I am going to take various credentials and just use them as globals at the top there. Okay, so let's take those. So the username and the password. I'm going to use the get pass again. I've changed my setup, so I need to alter that IP address. Okay, now this, the VLAN ID, I'm going to go for, this is what I'm going to configure on the box. So VLAN 4, VLAN name is going to be building C data. Data VLAN. Okay, fine. Now what we need to do is combine those credentials into a dictionary like we've done before, and actually take that VLAN data and create the dictionary for that. So I will copy that across. So obviously we've not started with our functions yet. That's next. Okay, so first of all, to create the first function that we're going to create, our first action is to log into the device. So let's create a login function. So to create a function, you start with def, so to define the function. So we'll call it login, and then we have to put the arguments that are required within the function. So this is the data that's going to be fed into the function, and these are requirements for running the function. Okay, so those requirements are the things that we need. We need to log in, we need the base URL, and we need our credentials. So that's going to be base URL. So that's one of the arguments that we need. The next one's going to be the credentials. Okay, so colon. Enter there, so we're indented here, so that's 4 spaces, 1 2 3 4. Okay, so the code that I'm running now is indented underneath the login function. So we're using the requests library. So what we can do is create a session there for requests, and that's what's going to the session object there that we're creating. That's essentially going to hold our cookie for us, so that what we can do is we can log in, and then we don't have to worry about parsing the cookie or the credentials there. It will be stored within the session, and we can pass the session to our subsequent functions. More on that in a moment. Okay, so this creates the session object. Now we need to do the actual HTTP call, which is the post to the base URL, and then log in and send our credentials. Okay, so the standard stuff for authenticating on our CX device. So it's the session object, and I'm going to run a post there, and this is that. So this is the credentials that we need to send to the device. So that's the base URL. Now, once that's filled in, you can see that that lights up, because running PyCharm there, what it actually does is it tells you if your parameters, your arguments, sorry, are unused, so they'll be grayed out until they're actually used, and then if you highlight that, it will highlight this one as well. It's moaning at me that I need to use two spaces there, so we'll bring that down. So notice there that creds is still unused. Okay, right, we need to do plus, and this is the string that we're going to send, so that login. So we need to, next up is the credentials that we are going to send for our authentication. We always have to do verify equals false to make sure that the HTTPS doesn't warn. And I always put a timeout of 2. Okay, so that's our call. Notice that response is still grayed out because it's not being reused later on in our function, but we're going to change that in a moment. Just to make sure that everything's okay visually, I'm going to print to screen the status code. There we are, using the dot format. So format there is then we put in, and this is the response. So remember, the response object is going to hold the response that comes back from my post. I'm going to take the status code from that. There we are. PyCharm's filled that out for me. Now, this is important for our subsequent interactions with the device. We need to return the session object. Okay, let me see if I can spell that correctly. There we go. So our function, so a good function should, we define it, it should perform an action. We're actually performing two actions here. We're logging in, and then we're printing to screen, and then it should return something. So it's returning this session from up here, okay, which will contain the cookie in the cookie jar for us, so that we need to use that session in our subsequent functions. Okay, so 2 spaces so it doesn't moan at me. Okay, right, the next thing that I want to do is I want to define a function to configure a VLAN on the device. Okay, so it's def again, and we'll call this one conf VLAN. And again, to log in, we're going to need the base URL. We don't need the credentials because we're not sending our username and password each time. We are actually going to be using the session. So the cookie jar loaded up with the cookie in the session that comes from the login, we're going to be using that. So that's one of the arguments that we need. So we use session there. And then if we're going to configure a VLAN, obviously we would need the basics to actually configure that via the API, which, as I showed you in previous videos, is the ID, which is up here. So we've got the ID and the name. So that's the basic criteria that is required to configure a VLAN on a CX device. So we will use that as an argument. That object there, VLAN underscore data, we will use that as an argument in our configuration VLAN function. Okay, right, so colon there, press return, and it with PyCharm it automatically indents that for us. So I'm going to create a configure VLAN object. So this will store the response from the configuration HTTP call, and this is the call that we're going to do. So it's a post, and we use the base URL, and it's to this one over here. I'll copy this across, so remember, this is the URL that we need to use, plus the base URL. Next up, we need to send the data. Now with request you can just do it as JSON equals VLAN data. So remember, that should light up. Right, so VLAN data and VLAN data, that's what we're going to send. So we are going to send that dictionary there, which will contain the ID. So it's going to contain actually 4 and building C data VLAN. Okay, that's what I'm going to be configuring, and it's the same things again for the to finish up the verify and the timeout. Okay, so that is a post call to system/bridge/VLANs with the VLAN data for us. Okay, and so it's nice to have, when you're doing stuff like this for the first time, it's nice to have some kind of confirmation on the screen. So I'm going to print to the screen configure VLAN status code, and we will do that, and format, and it will be the object from here, this C_VLAN object. C_VLAN, we will go for the status code. Okay, so that's our configure VLAN function. Next up, we're going to go and if we're following along here, we've got the configuration, and then we've got the get. Okay, so the actions here actually are to go and get the VLAN table with a depth of 1 from the CX box, and then to print that to screen. Now, one of the things that you might want to adhere to when you're building functions, I've got some print statements in some of my functions, but it's actually good practice to do a function to have one action and then return some data. So rather than doing a get and then a print from that get, you might want to look at doing a single get and then returning the JSON from that get, and then importing that and doing a print as a separate function, because otherwise you've got the two things tied together. You've always got the get and then a print to screen. If you combine those two together, you might not want that. You might want to just do a get and then some kind of logic check, and maybe not print to screen but do something else with it. So I do tend to write my functions to do just a separate get and then a separate print. So we'll do that. That will make more sense, I hope, as I'm showing you this. So because these print to screens, these are kind of basic infrastructure checks of the login and the configuration, so you can get the status code. But something like getting the whole VLAN table, all of that data, you might not necessarily want that printed to the screen each time. Okay, so what we're going to do first of all then is to do a get of the VLAN table. So it's the same thing again. Base URL, and the session is required. There's no actual data because it's just a get. There's no data that we're going to put into this. Okay, now we need to create an object which is going to store the VLANs. Okay, then we use session again, and it's a get call that we're doing, base URL plus, and then it's this one over here, which is the rest of the I'll just copy that across. So that's the URL that we're sending to of a depth of 1, verify false and a timeout of 2. Fine. Let's get rid of that. And then this is the point then. So my get, I'm not going to print to screen. I'm going to return the object to so that it can be picked up by the next function, which is going to be to print it to screen. So the argument that I'm going to use for my print VLAN is VLAN. So it's going to, so this call is going to return this, and then I'm going to use that as an argument in my print VLANs to print this to the screen as I please. So what I've got over here already is just a certain amount of formatting, which will print it to the screen so that it's got a header, and then it will be justified. So I'll copy that across. Okay, so this will be the header that will just print VLAN table to screen. Now this is the interesting point where we're going to do a for loop over the VLANs.json, and it will pick out the name and the ID. So we will get the VLAN of each one of the VLANs. We will get the name printed and the VLAN ID printed, and then I've just got a small a line of asterisks to format the bottom of that table to make it more obvious where the table ends when we're printing to screen. Now this is just all cosmetic. There's nothing special about this at all, and it's pretty dumb really to use the API in this way, to be honest, because all I'm doing, it would be much easier to get the VLAN table straight off of the CLI if that's all I wanted. As previously mentioned, the CLI definitely isn't dead. That's the best way for humans to get humanly readable data off of a device. But if you're using the API for programmatic interaction with a device, then you would probably do some kind of logic check to check that the certain VLANs were configured on a device. Probably not going to want to print that to screen each time. You probably just want to print the result of your logic check to screen. Okay, so for our functions, we've got our login, we've got our configuration of VLAN, we've got get the VLAN and print VLANs to screen, and finally we need to log out. So what we are going to do is we need to, for our credentials, we need to grab the base URL and we need the session. Okay, I'm going to create a logout response object. It's a post call to the base URL, and with the suffix of logout, and then it's verify equals false equals 2. Okay, and then I want to print to screen just to ensure that I've logged out correctly. Oh, let's make sure we've got that in there. Logout status, and then it's the logout response dot status code that I am going to use for that. Okay, so those are my functions. That is this script over here converted into functions. So what happens when we run this script? Let's open up a terminal. Okay, so it was Python 3, of course, VLAN funcs video 4. Funcs, sorry, there we are. Right, what happens when I run that script? We put in the username and the password, and nothing happens. Okay, so why is that? Now, this is one of the key differences between this type of script over here and these functions. So this script will run from the top. It will do the imports with the warnings, the username and the password, which we did see, and then it will run through each one of these, so all of the posts and the gets and the puts, etc., and then the logout. That will run when you run this script. Now, functions as reusable pieces of code, they will only run if you call them, okay? As you can see, you've got credentials in here which are not actually filled out, so we don't have the specific information which is being put into those functions at this point. So these are essentially, these functions aren't actually active when we run the script from the command line. What we need to do is we need to call them, okay? And one of the ways to do that is a bit of a trick. It's if you run at the bottom of your script, you can run this, which is if, and it's __name __. So that's it's abbreviated to dunder, okay? So that will be called dunder name. __main. So you may see this at the bottom of a script such as this, which essentially allows you to call the functions that are in the same script. Okay, so what we can do is, I've already got an example over here. So what we can do is we can combine at the bottom here. So this is like the workflow of the functions. This is what we want to, in this space here, this is where we can include what we want to do with the functions up here. So we define the functions up here, but then we call them at the bottom of the script here, okay? So what we want to do is create, first of all, we need to do, let's log in and get the VLAN table and then log out, okay? So it will be creating an object here. Okay, so these are the arguments that I'm going to feed into the login. Okay, so that the arguments will be this and this that will actually be fed into my login function when I call it. Then I'm going to create an object called VLANs and get the VLANs. So it's just using the base URL and the session. So the session comes from here. Now what I can do actually is I can now get the VLANs and print the VLAN to screen. Let's go VLANs. And then obviously we need to log out. And the session, okay. Right, so that is login, create the session that's needed. That's going to be the cookie jar object, essentially, the session object that's passed down to the other functions. So we've got a get VLAN function, we've got a print to screen, and then we're going to log out. So let's run that. Okay, and there you can see the script actually ran this time, doing what we asked it to do. So we've got a login, we've got the get, printed the VLANs to screen, so we've got these 3 VLANs on there, and then we have logged out and printed that to screen, okay? So here you can see how you can reuse this code to do some other actions though. So we don't have to keep repeating the code that we've used. What we do is we combine the functions that we've defined in our small script down here, okay? So that's great. So I've logged in, I've got the VLANs, I've printed it to screen. What if I want to configure a VLAN? So let's call the configure VLAN. And that requires the base URL I need the session object, and I need the information obviously that I'm going to use to create the VLAN. So that's the VLAN data. So we can put that in there for the configuration of the VLANs. Now, wouldn't it be good to actually then just print the VLAN to screen to make sure that it was configured? So we'll get it beforehand, configure the VLAN, and then get it and print it to screen. So rather than having to repeat ourselves like we would with this type of script and put the whole get and the print and the formatting to screen, what we can do is we just reuse this. So we can just copy that across after the configuration. So let's give that a different name. So VLANs 1 and VLANs 1. Okay, you do have to grab it again. If I'd have just tried to print to screen, I would have printed that object still. So you do have to, of post configuration, if I want to see the updated VLAN table, it's not just going to automatically update if I go to print to screen. If I need to do the get again to grab the new information and then print it to screen. Okay, so let's run that one. Okay, so actually before we do it, I'll just remind you that the information that I'm going to configure is this VLAN 4 and building C data VLAN. Okay. Right, so here's the function. So remember it's the same function that, the same script that I'm running, but I've changed it to add in some extra steps. Okay, so there we are. That's where I ran it. That is the login status. So that's our table this is the table prior to the configuration. There's the configuration event and the status code of 201, which means that our configuration was successful. And there's our new VLAN table, which we've done the get and then a print to screen. And there you can see our new VLAN. Okay, so we've got 3 VLANs there. We've got 4 VLANs configured there. Then we log out. Okay, so what I hope you can see is that you can define, rather than just configuring scripts like this, just these kind of quick and dirty scripts that run from top to bottom. If you start thinking about your code in terms of these type of building blocks, what you can do is that you can build scripts like this that become very powerful as you combine your building blocks into these workflows. And that's really how you can start to think about interacting at a programmatic level and starting to develop these network automation workflows. Okay, so that was a basic example of using Python functions to build building blocks of code that you can reuse to build these workflows that you can interact with the CX devices. I hope you enjoyed that. I hope you learned something. Please do like, comment, share and subscribe. I'll be back soon with another video, but that's all for now. My name's Joe Neville. Thanks for watching and goodbye.